We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things.
Not because they're easy, but because they're hard.
Podium, suit, tie. Kennedy's speech from Rice University. You must be thinking about the moon.
You got it. There is so much to learn. Why'd we go to the moon? How'd we get there?
But don't forget the most important part.
What was the Apollo program?
We're not going to talk about this for 10 years, are we?
Nope, just 30 minutes. This is STEM in 30. This is STEM in 30. Hi, I'm Marty.
And I'm Beth, and we are coming to you from Space Center Houston in Houston, Texas, where behind me you can see the shuttle carrier.
This aircraft is huge. This 747 was used to carry the space shuttle 70 times.
But we're not here to talk about the space shuttle program. We're going to talk about the Apollo program, and we're going to try and answer the big question, what was the Apollo program?
The mighty Centaur is on its pad at Cape Canaveral.
During the 1950s and 60s, the Soviet Union, now Russia, and the United States engaged in the space race, a competition between the two countries for superior spaceflight capabilities.
Dramatic strides by both sides in the space race give promise of major developments in man's efforts to actually send human explorers into the far reaches of the solar system.
From 1957, the USSR scored a series of firsts: the first object in orbit, the first object to hit the moon, and the first broadcast from the far side of the moon. In 1961, the Soviet Union secured another major victory, flying the first person into space. In response, President John F. Kennedy created a goal of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth by the end of the 1960s. Why did Kennedy choose the moon?
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
The Apollo program would not only accomplish Kennedy's goal, but would pave the way for a clear American victory, as the world would eventually watch an American be the first to set foot on the moon.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
But the journey to the moon did not come without losses. The first planned manned mission was Apollo 1. Tragedy struck during a ground test when a command module fire and poorly designed hatch caused the deaths of 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, on January 27, 1967. NASA suspended future manned missions in order to rebuild the command module and evaluate flammable materials inside the craft. The next manned mission was Apollo 7, successfully launching in 1968. Apollo missions 7 through 10 tested the equipment to land on the surface of the moon.
Beautiful view. Isn't that something?
Apollo 11 was the first to land on the moon on July 20th, 1969.
All right, Houston, loud and clear. Roger out. I'm clear, Houston. Roger.
The crew had 2 moonwalkers, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, as well as command module pilot Michael Collins, who would return them to Earth. There were 5 successful Apollo missions after Apollo 11, and 1 successful failure, Apollo 13. As trust and understanding of the Apollo hardware improved, the Apollo missions became scientific missions. The astronauts studied and photographed the lunar surface and collected samples of increasing mass. Among the program's many achievements, putting 12 men on the moon by the program's end in 1972.
And the old flag. Come on out here and give me a salute.
The Apollo program turned the aspirations of a nation into reality and inspired a country by proving it was possible to leave Earth and travel to another world. And it is those Apollo missions that have nurtured the dreams to explore even more distant worlds. The Apollo 11 command module that brought Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin back from the moon is getting ready to go on a nationwide tour.
And its first stop is here at Space Center Houston in Houston, Texas.
There is so much to see and do here. You can see the Apollo 11 command module. You can see the round peg in a square hole from Apollo 13, Gene Kranz's vest.
Whoa, Marty. Let's just take a tour of Space Center Houston. Before you even step inside Space Center Houston, you're sure to be wowed by this space shuttle replica, mounted on top of a shuttle carrier aircraft. Go inside both vehicles and learn what went into creating this engineering marvel. Inside Space Center Houston, you'll get the chance to let your imagination run wild.
We're one of the leading science and space learning centers in the nation, and we're so excited to tell about space exploration. And what we try to do is be that access point for students and teachers and people of all ages to experience space exploration.
Experience a virtual Martian sunset in the interactive exhibit Mission Mars, and explore a comprehensive collection of spacesuits actually worn by our brave space explorers. You can also see the Skylab 1G trainer, which helped astronauts prepare for America's first space station. And don't miss Space Center Houston's most popular attraction, NASA Johnson Space Center, just a tram ride away. Your ride will take you to Saturn V, the tallest, heaviest, and most powerful rocket ever flown. Space Center Houston is the first stop for the traveling exhibit for the Apollo 11 command module Columbia, the living quarters for the crew during most of the first manned lunar mission in 1969.
We'll be the only place where you can see Apollo 11 capsule and the Apollo 17 capsule, the first and the last of the lunar missions.
Can't make it to Houston to see the Apollo 11 command module? Other stops on its traveling tour are St. Louis, Pittsburgh, and Seattle. The National Air and Space Museum is responsible for many artifacts that returned from the Apollo 11 mission.
Neil Armstrong was the first person to step foot on the moon, and his spacesuit is an important artifact that helps tell that complex story of Apollo 11.
Let's take a look at Neil Armstrong's suit. Now we're joined by Dr. Kathy Lewis, who is a curator here in the Space History Division. Thank you very much for joining us.
Very glad to do so.
My first question is, I know that this is historically important because it was worn by the first person who walked on the moon. But as a curator, what other stories can you tell with this suit?
Well, the entire spacesuit collection is very special because until very recently, each of these suits were custom made. So not only is this the first, this was made specifically for Neil Armstrong. It was made to fit him so he would be comfortable, be able to do meaningful work on the surface of the moon. And it is really a mixture of mechanical devices and hand-sewn materials all put together into one big machine. It's a form-fitting machine. It's a form-fitting spacecraft that helped him walk on the moon.
So we've got all of this stuff going on up here. Do you want to tell us a little bit about, what some of this is on the suit?
One thing that is absent that many people don't notice, there's no way to tell that Neil Armstrong is the commander from this suit. There are no commander stripes. They were both identical on the surface of the moon. Well, as you mentioned before, there were only 5 photos of Neil Armstrong taken on the surface of the moon. So it didn't become an issue, and everyone knows the iconic photo of the salute in front of the flag is Buzz Aldrin. But it was decided that maybe we need to have a commander stripe, a red commander stripe on the suit, just so we know who is who. The other interesting thing that is unique about the Apollo 11 suits is that the patches are the original flown patches.
Okay.
Traditionally, the astronauts got their patches, they were cut off, and new patches were re-sewn in their place. But the price of being the first on the moon is that you don't get to get your patches. So these are the original patches. They tried to keep the suits as intact as they could as possible.
Now, is this a watch?
This is a pressure gauge. The astronauts had pressure gauges just to make sure their spacesuits were functioning. The astronauts wore their watches on the outside of their suits.
Okay.
They wore their Omega watches, chronographs, I'm sorry. I shouldn't say watches, on the outside of the suits, and they had these large Velcro watch bands that went outside. On other suits, you can see the marks where the chronograph was and the band was. In Neil Armstrong's case, he did not wear his chronograph when he was on the surface of the moon. He left his chronograph in the lunar module because the clock wasn't working well in the lunar module, so he left it there. So you don't have those marks on there that you would see on other spacesuits.
The only piece of the Saturn V rocket that returned to Earth during the Apollo missions were the command modules like the one you see behind me.
The National Air and Space Museum recently completed a 3D scan of the Apollo 11 command module Columbia.
If you take a look at the scan, you can see the ablated heat shield underneath, and inside you can see notes that the astronauts took for themselves.
The Apollo 11 mission is a historical landmark. It represents so much to so many people. It has become representative of a mindset. When we put our mind to something, we can accomplish it. And the only part of that mission that come home is the command module. It's just awe-inspiring to be the curator responsible for this. For 40 years, knowing how important it was to protect the object, it had to be protected by a plexiglass cover. But now we are removing the protective plexiglass. We have a unique opportunity to do this documentation.
The Smithsonian Air and Space Museum gave us incredible access to this object. Our team set out to 3D scan the command module, the exterior and the interior, to create a 3D model that we're delivering online. It's probably the most complex 3D project that our team has undertaken so far. The command module had many sort of hidden nooks and crannies that were really hard to see, and we need to be able to get line of sight to the object. So we used a robotic or a motion control system to basically remotely control cameras and 3D scanners to get around all those different hidden areas that are very inaccessible. The precision of the 3D measurement tools we're using is incredible. We're using laser scanners that capture over 1 million measurement points per second at sub-millimeter accuracy. We also used 6 other 3D capture methods, and we're able to pull all those 3D capture methods into one cohesive 3D model.
So what you're seeing here is some of the really early draft data. This is the raw unprocessed data, and you can see at the center of this scan, it's shooting its beam out in all these different directions, and that generates this cloud of points. And those are three-dimensional measurements that have been made. And so we have to scan from many different locations in and around the object and put these jigsaw puzzle pieces together to make a unified whole.
Our team collected over 7 terabytes of information over a 2-week period. So this is an extraordinary amount of information. The biggest challenge represented was marrying 6 different data sets with different levels of accuracy into one unified 3D model.
We found that through the data, that different stories emerge. Technically, we were aware that there was detailed communications between mission control and the astronauts. Until now, we've had their voices, and then to be able to see that they reacted to these things by actually writing them down on the spacecraft walls, I think is sort of thrilling, because you can actually imagine yourself being in the position of the astronauts. There's a small rectangle with X's on it. We now know that that was sort of an improvised calendar that Mike Collins sort of created. There were markings which humanize certain aspects of those things. What this technology does, it enables us to take the first lunar landings in a concrete form and sort of index it. It's a table of contents, a way to provide a more meaningful access for the young person who just would be thrilled to know what it was like inside of a spacecraft that went to the moon and back.
I'm really inspired and excited about how maybe this 3D scan could inspire future generations to do great things.
If you're interested in some really cool experiments, Space Center Houston is the place to come.
But before you come, you might need a little practice.
Take a look at these hands-on experiments.
When you're traveling in space, it's important to be able to communicate with the Earth, both for your orders from mission control and to keep in touch with family and friends.
In the 1960s, when we first sent man to the moon, it was vitally important, and the predominant way that we communicated back then was line of sight. So if this is our signal that we're passing back between Earth and our spacecraft, basically we just pass that signal back, but we have to be able to see each other while we're doing that. That gets much harder when you bring the moon into play. So let's bring our moon over. Come on in. When the spacecraft goes behind the moon, line of sight goes away. You cannot pass that signal through the moon to get it to the spacecraft.
During Apollo 11, Michael Collins traveled around the far side of the moon, and he was unable to communicate with the Earth.
This is going to continue to be a problem for long-duration spaceflight. And one way to fix that is by using satellites. So let's imagine that this is Mars now on a future journey there, and bring in Satellite Michelle. Come on in. So now I'm still Earth, and Beth is our spaceship that's on the other side of Mars. Again, I cannot use line of sight, so I'm going to have to send that signal through a satellite in orbit around Mars. It will relay it to the spacecraft and then back to Earth. And that's how we will communicate on a future journey to Mars.
Michael Collins piloted the command module around the far side of the moon.
Communication was more difficult, and there were stretches of time where he was out of communication with mission control.
I finally got a chance to ask him if he felt any real sense of isolation. The answer I got was not what I expected. Today I am joined by Apollo 11 astronaut Michael Collins. Thank you so much for being here today.
Beth, thank you so much for having me.
Now, you flew the command module by yourself around the far side of the moon where there was no communications.
Yes.
Was that isolating?
No, it was a wonderful experience, and it was nice in a way that you might not expect, but the fact that it was quiet, silent, utterly, was good, not bad. It gave me a little time off from mission control telling me this, that, and the other. So I enjoyed the time by myself.
How long was that break around the backside?
55 minutes, maybe, something like that.
So you got a full hour of quiet.
Close to it, yeah.
Time to yourself. Now, I understand you have taken up painting.
Yes, I do a lot of watercolor painting these days, and I enjoy it. It's a nice hobby. You know, you don't need a tee-off time or a lot of equipment. It's something that the more you delve into, the more you realize you don't know very much about how to go about it, and that's fascinating. You know, it's kind of like peeling the leaves off an artichoke. Oh, look at that one down there. I never thought about that before, and so on.
And you'd like to spend a lot of time outdoors, because I've seen some of your paintings, and you like to do a lot of the nature paintings. I guess it's another quiet time for you.
Well, I do. I fish a lot, and I try to do one sprint triathlon a year, so that keeps me, you know, run, bike, swim, and I can't do those things indoors. Although I might try, come to think of it, that would be a little easier.
Was there anything that you learned while you were training on Earth that really did prepare you for the Apollo missions?
No, everything I learned. You know, you bring to a flight 30 years of living on this dinky little planet, and whatever you've been able to put together and try to retain, all that, I think, goes into the preparation for a flight.
Now, you were part of the space program when really it was in its infancy, and there were a lot of experiments going on. Did you ever feel like a guinea pig as you were flying around?
Oh, frequently, yes. Because of course, guinea pigs are always getting injected and subjecting themselves to the latest medical advances, and we had a fairly strong, but fortunately a very friendly and competent medical component to our training.
What did we learn from that helps us now with long-term spaceflight?
Well, there are a number of things, many of which I have just read about. For instance, effects on the blood supply to your eye, which changes in weightlessness. Of course, we felt stretched out. We actually were a little bit taller because the space between your vertebrae extends a bit. These things are not important at all for the kind of work we were doing, you know, to the moon and back in 8 days. Not a medical challenge in that, but if you're talking about several years to Mars and back, then the medical component, the medical considerations become extremely important, perhaps paramount to such a trip.
Now, when you were growing up, did you ever read science fiction?
I did, yeah. I was a Buck Rogers fan. I used to prowl around in the caverns of Mongo, and I'm quite familiar with them.
Do you think that influenced you wanting to be an astronaut?
Not really. My coming in to being an astronaut was sort of a stair-step program. I had an opportunity to go to West Point, which was a free education, and that was a very important consideration. And then when I graduated, I drifted over into the Air Force, became a pilot. One thing led to another. I was a test pilot at Edwards, and that at that time was a good entry point to the astronaut program.
Now, have you ever experienced failure?
I applied for the second group of astronauts, and I didn't make it. I was at that time just a brand new test pilot, and they said, "Yeah, you don't know enough." So I was very disappointed. It was a big flop. It was a big failure. Then the next time I lucked out and came into it.
How did you deal with that, going from being turned down to reapplying?
It ain't pleasant, I will certainly say that. No, but you try to analyze what they liked about you, what they didn't like about you, and if you could do anything about the parts that they didn't like, well, you gave that a lot of thought.
Another member of the Apollo 11 crew was Buzz Aldrin.
That famous picture that you've seen of the first men walking on the moon, that was actually a picture of Buzz Aldrin.
Let's take a closer look at that iconic photo. It is an extraordinary image that continues to inspire humankind decades after it was taken. A photograph of a man on the moon. Neil Armstrong was the photographer, while Buzz Aldrin was at the center of the photo. So what was actually happening at this moment frozen in time?
So there are several interesting things about the photograph of Buzz Aldrin on the moon that are worth noting here. And of course, this image is very commonly known as the Moon Man image. One, you can see that it's actually quite spontaneously done. In that there are moving parts. You can see that Aldrin's, his left arm, is actually sort of at an angle, which shows that he was turning himself just prior to this image. It takes a lot of effort to move in a spacesuit, and so you could see that he was actually still trying to move himself around.
Almost 5 decades after that unplanned snapshot, Aldrin reminisced by tweeting, quote, "When Neil took this pic of me, it was very spontaneous. He said, 'Stop right there,' and I turned. You can see the motion of the strap."
Probably the most important feature of this image is the fact that the visor of Buzz Aldrin's spacesuit is very reflective. And in a sense, we can actually see ourselves in this image. You can see the photographer, Neil Armstrong, in that reflection. And so there's a lot of symbolism in that, but there's also a lot of meaning in the fact that you can not only see Buzz Aldrin in that image, but also Neil Armstrong.
Although the moment itself was spontaneous, the mission was far from it. It took years of research and the hard work of scientists, mathematicians, engineers, and of course, the man front and center, Buzz Aldrin.
He was a military child and decided to go to West Point, was a very high achiever, was third in his class, and went on to become a pilot. And then later was given the opportunity to go on and study at MIT to receive his PhD, in which he studied the idea of orbital rendezvous, which became a real signature feature of the Apollo program, and in fact became a signature feature of our ability to get to the moon.
A space rendezvous is when 2 spacecraft arrive at the same orbit and approach each other until they get very close. Aldrin would earn the name Dr. Rendezvous for pioneering techniques in orbital mechanics. That's the study of the motions of space vehicles. This expertise, along with his dedication to becoming an astronaut, would eventually propel him to the moon and into an image representing the incredible possibilities in space exploration.
The image of Buzz Aldrin on the moon with Neil Armstrong reflected in the visor is very symbolic of the fulfillment of a vision that existed throughout the 1960s of landing a person on the moon and then returning them safely to the Earth. It symbolizes that achievement, but it also symbolizes the sort of actual human character of the 2 individuals who made it to the moon. And of course, there are 2 of only 12 people to have ever done it. But this image continues to live on as our symbol of human achievement in spaceflight.
The Apollo program was amazing. It was then followed by the space shuttle.
The big question is, what's next?
I'm at Johnson Space Center in Building 9, the Space Vehicle Mock-Up Facility. I'm joined by Julie Kramer-White, the Chief Engineer of Orion. Julie, thanks for talking with us today.
No problem, my pleasure.
Tell me about Orion.
Well, Orion is the next generation of human spaceflight vehicle. It's intended to allow us to take the crews out into deep space and do exploration in the cislunar region, so kind of Earth, Moon region, and then on beyond when accompanied by other elements. But this is a full-scale version of the mock-up that we use here to work with training the crew and trying out some of the equipment.
What lessons did we learn from Apollo that are being used on Orion?
Well, we learned a ton from Apollo, right? I mean, Apollo is our heritage. It's where we started 50 years ago. And so some of the things we learned during Apollo are still really relevant, like the shape of the capsule. The capsule is actually what we call the outer mold line is an exact replica of Apollo. There's a reason for that. It means all the aerodynamic databases, all the things we learned on re-entry from Apollo still apply. Even though it's a little bit bigger, it still applies. So we leverage all that information to make our understanding of what's going on with Orion that much better.
What are some of the biggest challenges that you've faced with working on Orion?
We had some challenges in being able to do some things that actually we had done during Apollo. So, like I talked about a little bit earlier, that this design is similar in a lot of ways to Apollo on the outside, very different on the inside, but similar on the outside. We had to reformulate the heat shield for this vehicle. So we had built heat shields back in the 50s for doing this kind of entry, very hot coming back from the moon, much hotter than coming back from, say, space station or low Earth orbit. So we actually had to reformulate and rebuild the heat shield. So from basically paper notes, which was kind of interesting, right? So trying to gather up all the things and things we can't do anymore because they're considered carcinogenic, for example. So we had to go get new materials and reformulate it and retest it from the ground up and reconstitute it to be able to use it on the vehicle, which is pretty cool.
Wow. So we've gone from Apollo to the space shuttle and now back to this type capsule. Why that change back?
Yeah, there's definitely some reasons for that. So you think about a capsule, it's much smaller, more compact. It's very good from an ascent and a re-entry perspective. It's easy to get the vehicle back safely because of its compact nature re-entering. Something like shuttle, which is much more like a truck and can do all different kinds of missions and can carry these huge things in its payload bay, but re-entering with that complex geometry and the wings, and then ascent with a side-mounted payload versus a payload that's up on top. That's one of the main reasons we went back to a capsule, was to be able to put the crew back up on top, where it's actually easier to get them away if there's a problem. So as you know, we have a large launch escape tower on top of the vehicle, similar to Apollo, but different in many ways. More sophisticated, more computer controlled than we could have done in the 60s. So it makes for a little bit smoother ride, but still a very large rocket that could pull you off the launch vehicle if there's a problem. Could have never done that with shuttle.
Something we hope we never have to
Something
use.
we hope we never have to do, but we think it's important that we be able to remove the crew from a dangerous situation. So there's differences in strength of those different vehicles and differences in the missions.
This is the Orbiter Access Arm on display here at Space Center Houston, where you can literally walk in the footsteps of astronauts. Over 50 crews walked right here and loaded up onto the space shuttle.
Before we end today, we want to leave you with a preview of STEM in 30.
Each of our shows is live.
They're interactive.
And they're archived online for free for you to use in your classrooms. This is STEM in 30. Here's what's happening this season on STEM in 30.
We take a highway to the danger zone to check out what happens on an aircraft carrier.
What roles do music and the arts play in space travel? Learn about the psychology of long-term space flight.
Next stop, Mars. Meet Orion, the space capsule that could be flying to the red planet.
Speaking of flying, we learn about the airplane's family tree.
Also on STEM in 30, we'll show you how to train to become an astronaut.
We'll also learn about the science of staying safe
and the engineering behind the world record skydive.
And you get to learn how scientists and you can explore the universe. That's all this season on STEM in 30.
Unfortunately, we are out of time here at Space Center Houston.
We leave you today with the sights and sounds of the launch of the Saturn V.
Thanks for watching.
At 15 seconds, guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. We have a liftoff. Liftoff on Apollo 11.